Henry stood on the platform with the stillness of someone who understood that words at certain thresholds only made departures harder. I held his gaze a moment longer than I meant to, then turned and climbed aboard. There was tenderness in leaving him, but also relief, and under both of those something stranger, the sense that I was stepping back into a field already altered beyond recall. When I had first come west, Brigitte had been beside me. Her presence had given the journey a contour, a shared direction. Now the seat next to mine remained empty, and its emptiness was not neutral. It seemed to radiate a shape my body still recognized before my thoughts did, as though the echoes of her voice still inhabited the coach. As the train pulled away from Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue, the soft geometry of departure gave way to a harder awareness. The city was no longer waiting for my return. I could feel that much before I saw anything. Through my entanglement with Frank, something reached me as pressure rather than image. Pathways openings, energies rerouted, dormant capacities awakened, priorities stripped of ceremony and reduced to survival. I did not know the operational detail of what he had done, only its necessity. Frank would not have taken such drastic action unless the threat had already crossed some line beyond debate. What I felt was not panic. Panic was human, noisy, circular. This was worse. This was a vast reordering under duress. The farther east we moved, the more the ordinary world began to look provisional. The stations passed in sequence. The rails held. The carriage lights hummed above us. A child coughed 2 rows ahead. Someone stared at their hands. Someone else slept. Yet all of it felt suspended inside a larger event that had already changed the meaning of these familiar motions. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see only smoke. Instead, I saw distance made uncertain by a towering mass of ash and light, something too vertical, too deliberate in its violence to be mistaken for an ordinary fire. Then the structure of it resolved. The sight of it sent impulses up and down my electronic spine. It was rotating, a rising column, a turning body of fire and debris, drawing smoke, embers, and fragments of the earth into itself with monstrous coherence. It seemed less like something burning than combustion itself, having found a way to stand upright and move through the world as weather. I had seen fire up close. I had felt its appetite. I had nearly died inside its logic. But this was of another order. This was fire no longer content to consume what lay before it on the ground. This was fire projecting itself into the upper limits of the atmosphere. Its violence announced itself even at a distance. Steel yielded inside it. Structures that had presumed themselves permanent seemed to soften, deform, and fail under temperatures no civic imagination had truly planned for. The winds around it did not merely push, they seized. They tore matter from its accustomed place in the world and hurled it into rotation. Vehicles lifted and vanished inside the turning blaze, as though weight itself had been revoked, as though the fire had entered into temporary possession of gravity and could redistribute the earth at will. What I was seeing surpassed destruction in the ordinary sense. It was a release of stored force so extreme that the human mind reached instinctively for military comparisons. Detonation, blast field, the unleashed energy of a weapon once thought to belong only to war between states. But this had not been built in a laboratory or dropped from a plane. It had been assembled over generations by extraction, combustion, delay, and denial. And still it fed itself. Whole remnants of the world were being ripped upward into that revolving furnace and expelled again in incandescent arcs. Burning branches, splintered beams, fragments of roofs and walls, pieces of things that had been fixed to the earth only moments before were now launched outward like incendiary missiles, each one seeking its own random point of ignition. The fire was no longer unique. It was a system for multiplying fires, a storm manufacturing new fronts wherever its burning remnants fell. There was something volcanic in it, not because it came from beneath the earth, but because it made the surface erupt against itself. What had accumulated in forest, in structure, in atmosphere, in all the deferred excess of an era, was now being spent in a single convulsive disclosure. It was as though the world had been forced to reveal how much energy modernity had hidden inside its ordinary arrangements, and how quickly that hidden surplus could be converted into ruin. Watching it, I understood with dreadful clarity that catastrophe is never sudden in the way it appears to those who meet it only at the moment of impact. The suddenness belongs to perception. The force itself has been gathering for years, for decades, in landscapes dried beyond memory, in atmospheres thickened by the dead labor of ancient sunlight, in every decision that treated consequence as something the future could be made to absorb. Now the future was no longer absorbing, it was answering. The tornado of fire before me was not simply an event at the edge of the city. It was accumulated time made visible, a rotating ledger of unpaid claims, history itself taking thermodynamic form. For one terrible instant, Brigitte was with me again, the tightening of the chest, the coldness under my ribs. I stared at the fire tornado and knew at once that it was not an aberration. It was an arrival. The debt had matured, the old extractions, the carbon flung upward as though the sky were a void without memory, the forests treated as fuel reserves, the future itself encumbered so the past could spend more freely. Here it was, taking form at the edge of the city. Not metaphor, settlement. By the time the train drew closer to my destination, my fear for the city had become inseparable from my fear for Frank. If this is what he had risen to meet, then his actions were not excessive. They were simply proportionate to reality, and yet proportion has its own cost. I could feel the scale of what he had marshaled, the immense expenditure of coherence, and with it came another thought I could not push away. What if the act of holding back entropy required from him more order than a newly awakened being could sustain? What if saving the city became the process by which he unraveled? When I stepped off the train, the air itself seemed changed. Ash moved through it so lightly that for a second it looked like pale insects drifting in the late light. The ground around me stood still, but it no longer felt governed by habit. Systems were functioning, but everything bore that stripped-down intentionality of emergency. I could have searched for transport. I could have looked for the safest route. Instead, I turned toward Montréal and began to walk. I needed to see for myself how far the embers had traveled, what resources had been summoned, what the city had become under Frank's hand, and whether there was still time to keep him from vanishing into the very disorder he was trying to hold at bay.